We are up for a wonderful treat. We have our next panel, which is entitled Understanding CSEC and Ending the Pipeline. We have with us moderating Maheen Kaleem. We have Dr. Jamelia Blake, Yasmin Vofa, Dr. Mary Burke, and Dr. Mary Carrasco. I'm not going to spend too much time. I'm going to let the ladies jump right into it because it's a short hour session and want to just get into all the information that they have to share. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Maheen.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and good morning, everyone. We're so honored to be here with you this morning, and I know I derived a lot of energy from the incredible panelists this morning who are leading with their wisdom and their expertise, so thank you for that. We have a very esteemed panel today of experts who could talk for more than an hour each about their various areas of expertise. So we hope that, we've tried to consolidate some of the information into somewhat of a condensed format, but we'll make sure that there's time for discussion and questions at the end because we know that we imagine there's a lot to discuss. So I'll go ahead and start by introducing myself, and then I'll turn it over to each of the panelists to do that, and then we'll just jump right in. So my name is Maheen Kaleem. I am currently the Deputy Director of Grantmakers for Girls of Color, and I'm calling in actually this morning from San Francisco, although I'm based in Washington, D.C. And I have kind of spent most of my adult life working alongside and with survivors of commercial sexual exploitation in various ways, both as a direct service provider and as a policy advocate and a researcher. And I'm so excited for you to hear from our esteemed panel. And it looks like it's actually Dr. Blake's birthday today. So I will turn it over to the birthday girl to introduce herself first.
Good morning. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Dr. Jamelia Blake. I am a professor at Texas A&M University. I'm also a licensed psychologist. And I'm invited to this panel because of the work that I've done related to Black girls and discipline disparities. Most notably, I was a lead researcher on the adultification bias report that was released a few years ago. So I have been doing work for Black girls. I just want to put a plug in. I'm so energized by this conference. Every time I come, it fills my spirit up. And even in the virtual world, so authentic. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to be part of the conversation and talk about how my work on adultification bias impacts the exploitation of children. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Blake, and happy birthday. So maybe I'll turn it over to Yasmin Vafa next.
Good morning, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here. Happy birthday, Dr. Blake. It's wonderful to see your face. I am the co-founder and executive director of Rights for Girls, which is a human rights organization based out of Washington, D.C. And we work at the intersections of race, gender, violence, and the law. And so much of our work is really focused on ending the policies and the narrative that criminalize girls for experiences of gender-based violence. And so we were one of the authors of the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline report. We had launched a national campaign around the concept that there is no such thing as a child prostitute, working to really interrogate the fact that children are not only being exploited all around this country, but are too often being criminalized for their exploitation. And so I'm very honored to be on this panel, and I am looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Yasmin. Dr. Carrasco?
I have to unmute. Happy birthday, Dr. Blake. I'm a pediatrician and I've worked with high-risk communities for a long time. I don't really want to say how long. And currently, I mostly do evaluations of children who are suspected victims of child abuse in general. Okay, we can move on.
Thank you. Dr. Burke?
Good morning. Happy birthday, Dr. Blake. I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. And I'm a psychology professor at Carlow University. I've been in that role for 18 years. I oversee our doctoral program in counseling psychology. So I get to work with clinicians and try to help them become the best clinicians they can be. Our doctoral program has a really strong focus on social justice. And it's one of 3 in the country in our discipline that does, and it has that at our foundational core. So we're training psychologists to not just work with individuals and families and couples. We're training them to look at the systemic issues related to racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, and understand how they're working and then how they can hopefully make change within the systems they work in the future. So whether they're in an agency, or we teach them how to write policy papers and things like that to make change. I've worked on the issue of human trafficking for, I think, about 17 or so years, and have done so in a variety of ways on the ground, organizing and in the clinical setting with survivors.
Thank you so much. And as you all can see, we have a lot of expertise with us today. So I'll start maybe by grounding the conversation. And I was so fortunate, I know all of us were, to hear from the incredible panel right before us this morning. And one of the things that a lot of the young leaders really spoke about was adultification of girls. So before and particularly Black girls. And so I'm wondering actually, Dr. Blake, if we can start with you, and really ground ourselves in the cultural conversations that inform prevention, intervention, or a lack thereof. And you have written extensively about cultural attitudes towards Black girls and how those attitudes actually impact our policies. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about that research, and specifically if you can talk about how some of the tropes or attitudes towards Black girls might actually increase their vulnerability to commercial sexual exploitation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Maheen. So just to begin, I want to unpack and define this idea of adultification, which in my work, I've really conceptualized as a bias, as a lens, if you will, colored glasses in which people in our society see Black girls. And adultification bias is this idea that Black girls are seen as more adult-like. They don't need protection. They don't need to be comforted. They're not seen as being vulnerable. And this bias really originates from the stereotypes that perpetuate and are mapped onto Black women in our daily lives. And those stereotypes trickle down to that of Black girls. And the stereotypes of Black women being as aggressive, hypersexualized, even the idea of a Black woman being invincible, right? The Sojourner syndrome. All of those stereotypes, which have historical roots in slavery, right? The legacy of slavery kind of allows those stereotypes to perpetuate in the media, in our daily lives, trickle down on Black girls. And what that means is that when adults are interacting with Black girls, they don't necessarily know very much about them. They already come in with this perception that I'm not really interacting with a child, I'm interacting with an adult, and they treat them that way. So they essentially rob Black girls of their innocence in their childhood because they do not afford them the opportunity to make mistakes. What's particularly relevant to this conversation is the fact that Black girls are not seen as victims, right? So I think the panel, again, I've just been so inspired, but the panel, which should be a Gwen's Girls podcast, but anyway, the last panel really talked about how this is normalized, this idea that these young women wanted this, that they weren't a victim, they sought this out, they were hypersexualized, they were seen as fast, and also really speaks to the fact that, you know, no one in the community, in the larger community, are really questioning the motives of these men, right? It's still seen that these Black girls are deserving of this treatment, and girls in general, but particularly we see this for Black girls. So adultification bias really impacts the way that Black girls interact with different agencies and how they're received and the extent to which their stories are believed and they're comforted and they're given the appropriate supports to overcome the challenges of being exploited.
Thank you so much. I know there's so much to unpack there. So hopefully there'll be some time for more discussion. But I want to turn it to you, Dr. Carrasco, for a second to talk from your perspective as a physician who's been treating child abuse and exploitation for many years. If you can share a little bit about what we miss when it comes to preventing commercial sexual exploitation of children. At what ages? You know, there's a lot of discussion and debate about what the average age of entry is into the life. And sometimes we miss those preventative factors that actually are where the story starts. And so I'm wondering also if you can talk about the intersection between child abuse and commercial sexual exploitation of children, and what signs are we missing or are important to recognize?
Right. So many years ago, when I first switched from doing general pediatrics in a high-risk neighborhood to doing child abuse, I sort of challenged myself to figure out, were I in general practice, would I recognize this child who's now before me because they've disclosed sexual abuse to someone or tripped into the system in some way, and I was now seeing them for a medical exam. So this is a child who has already disclosed abuse, not necessarily trafficking. Would I, as a general pediatrician, be able to tell that this particular child was a victim of abuse? And I'm sad to say that, at least for myself, the answer was no. The answer was the kid who's top of her class and cheerleader and doing all sorts of in the theater group and in everything, student government, everything, could be a victim of child abuse. And we have this image that, and I've seen it taught particularly in the area of child sex trafficking, that the kid who's being trafficked is that meek, low self-esteem kid who's looking down, and don't have that preconceived notion. Get rid of it, because anybody could be the victim of child sex trafficking. Don't look for one particular stereotype. Keep your mind open to the possibility that any of the kids coming in front of you could be the victim of abuse. Since I see mostly victims of child abuse, suspected child abuse, um, I'm more likely to see the kid with unexplained injuries or sexually transmitted disease and so on. But if you're looking at it from a general perspective, if you see a kid who has unexplained sexually transmitted disease and is just very hesitant to tell you anything, that could be the victim of abuse. And that child may not disclose right away. One of the things you have to find a way to do is to separate the person who's in the room, whose role it is to prevent the child from telling anything. I just tell the parent, it's standard for me to talk to the kid alone. I will not examine this child without someone in the room, but I'm going to talk to them alone. So I get the parent out of the room, and I have very cooperative nurses who make sure that they're not standing at the door with their ear against the door. So you have to find a way to not only talk to the kid alone, but gain the kid's trust. And that is not necessarily an easy kind of thing to do. Another popularly held belief is that kids begin to be trafficked at 12 to 16, teenagers. And I've seen kids very much younger than that who've been the victims of abuse, often trafficked by family members. And I think one needs to keep an open mind to that possibility, because I think people don't assume that family members could be trafficking kids. They just have this impression that it has to be someone on the outside. So keep all those ideas in mind. I'm sorry not to be able to give you a checklist because every checklist that I've seen doesn't fit with my experience. So.
One part of that, I imagine, is probably because so much of this is about building relationship and trust, and that every young person needs to be treated to their specific needs.
Right.
So turning to you, Dr. Burke, I'm wondering if we can actually shift our conversation towards, now that we have a little bit of grounding in the why and the what are effective intervention strategies? And you have been addressing CSEC, as you mentioned in your introduction, from both a behavioral and mental health perspective, but also at a community-based perspective for many years. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about effective interventions or things to be mindful of from the behavioral and mental health perspective, what's important for providers to know, and generally, what are some promising strategies that you've seen?
Great, thank you. I think this is a perfect flow from what Dr. Carrasco just said and what Dr. Blake was speaking about earlier, but in particular that there's no, as you know, there's no one size fits all with regard to identification, similarly with regard to treatment. I think there's often a push for empirically validated treatments when we're dealing with mental health, and that those treatments can be very useful. And I think there's more for us to pay attention to with that. And I want to also call attention to the panel earlier where Ms. Robinson, Ms. Brown, Ms. Christian Moreland, Ms. Maid, and Ms. Jones spoke. They offered insight that is invaluable to all of us working on the field. And I just want to give a shout out and thank you for that, you young women. I'm going to do something here. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to do the PowerPoint sharing thing. I hope that's okay. Okay, so I think that what's really important when we are working with anyone, but when we're working with people, is to think about the whole person. And what we know with regard to our youth who have been involved in commercial sexual exploitation is that they usually have some kind of a history of difficulty that predates that. And what that history of difficulty means to me is that we adults have failed them in the community. So we're messing up, and this is what some of their experiences have been. So a lot of them have been in child protective services, experienced prior sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. They've been exposed to substance misuse in the home, domestic violence, poverty, discrimination we know associated with race and gender. We also know that this is often, the commercial sexual exploitation is often predated by running away from home. And again, sometimes I think we hear a child running away from home and there's this idea that the child is doing something wrong. And as Ms. Buckner mentioned earlier in her session, there's probably nothing that child's doing wrong. They're probably trying to take care of themselves and get safe away from the people at home. Not always, but often. So I just wanted to share that. So we're talking about kids who, before this commercial sexual exploitation, most likely didn't have a lot of people offering positive support. The young women in the other session also talked about self-esteem. They most likely didn't have folks helping with build up self-esteem. Now, again, there are exceptions to this, because I'm not trying to fault the whole community all the time. I'm just saying that this is a lot of what we see. So there are people trying out there and people who have been exposed to commercial sexual exploitation who do have people loving them and trying to do their best. So the reason I wanted to bring up that piece, just that remind us about that background, is because again, we're thinking about this whole person, and we want to have that in mind when they're in front of us and what happened before now, and not just get caught up in the now. We know that the impacts of commercial sexual exploitation and sexual abuse have they go along with a lot of problems, difficulties, pain psychologically, and I've noted some of them here. The one that's most important to me is difficulty in interpersonal relationships. And to me, the reason that's the most important is because we are here to love each other and to have relationships, whether it's with our friends, our coworkers, or our romantic partners, or kids in the future. And the defenses that get built up in someone suffering from this kind of abuse can make that hard. So to me, that's one of the most important pieces. So I wanted to just right here, thinking about all this trauma, like trauma upon trauma. We know that negative effects, so the person has to build up more defenses. The negative effects are more problematic when the abuse that one experiences is frequent, severe, of long duration, involves force, and is in particular perpetrated by someone close to them, because that trust is ruptured so close to the heart and makes those trusting relationships more difficult to secure later. So this is what we're talking about. We might see some of this in our youth when we go back to thinking about what are we looking for in that imperfect checklist that Dr. Krosko mentioned earlier. But what might we see in our kids if they're being commercially exploited or otherwise? And I'm trying to move kind of quickly because I know we have a lot of important things to hear from everyone. What I want us to take away from this, because I was mentioning empirically validated treatments and they're so popular, but there's more to it. And I think that it's the healing relationally. We heal through each other and through relationships with each other. Again, whether it's a social worker, whether it's a friend, an auntie, a sister, mother, a future partner. And we have to be prepared for this kind of acting out against the people who are trying to reach out. So we as carers, service providers, might be pushed against a lot. We need to kind of stand in ourselves and keep loving this individual and understanding that they're projecting onto us all the pain and hurt and ugly stuff that they feel inside. So paying attention to that and looking for these kinds of reenactments in particular when you're thinking about sexual healing from sexual violence. This part's a little bit more complicated, but some of the stuff that a person who has experienced sexual violence might put on us, that people are trying to help them heal, can make us feel as if we are in sometimes the victim role. There's a way that psychologically they might try to make us feel what they're feeling. And it can kind of it can get murky and it can get tense, but being aware of what's happening. So we might feel in relation to this person, we might feel like the victim, we might feel like the perpetrator, we might feel like the rescuer, we might feel like the bystander, and the child client or young adult client is going to maybe go through all of these positions also. And we need to, what we do with that is we identify it and say, hey, wait a second, I'm wondering what's happening here, and could this be some kind of we're not going to use the word reenactment necessarily, but I'm wondering if how I'm feeling right now might be how you felt when this was happening. I feel like you're trying to make me out to be the bad guy here, and I'm wondering if somehow you feel like the bad guy. So, and these kinds of responses and attention to these dynamics can take place in the therapy room, but again, in the context of these other relationships. So folks, if you're working out there as a friend or as in a social service agency, in any kind of a setting, kind of pay attention to this, we can help our loved ones work through this. I think that's all I really wanted to say. I have some recommendations, but I think that that's a little premature. So I will stop the share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burke. And we're certainly going to get to recommendations because you all have been whizzing by in terms of your responses, so we could get to some discussion. So I have a lot of follow-up questions, but and yes, I see that there's a question in the chat about the PowerPoint being available somewhere, and we'll definitely be able to send out resources after the panel. But I want to, one of the themes, Yasmin, that's been coming up in our conversation today and this morning is really about how systems have not adequately have failed to respond to girls, to young people. And I'm wondering if we can pull it back a little bit in thinking about interventions from a policy and a legal perspective. What do you see that is working? Are there promising policies or practices, particularly as we think about how to talk to systems? Because I think all of our panelists have mentioned, we have failed, and I've found in my own work with you often that systems can be quite defensive, actually, about being told that they're not adequately serving or seeing young people the way that they need to be seen. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, particularly the role of the juvenile and family courts in preventing and addressing CSEC. And maybe also, since we have a little time, if you can also expand a little bit on the cultural conversations that we're not having that actually contribute to all of this existing.
Sure. So that was a lot, and I will do my best, but please continue to prompt me if I missed a part of that question. But I think First, going back to what Dr. Blake laid out, which I think is essential to anyone working on this issue. Of course, you know, any child can be vulnerable to trafficking, and I think that's really critical to note, and I think that's very, very important for us to recognize. However, there are certain risk factors, and there are certain systemic issues and historical legacies that render some kids more vulnerable to being sexually exploited than others. And so I think that's very important to recognize, and I think understanding the racial and gender disparities of child sex trafficking victims is critical. And so I'm going to quickly put a link in the chat to a fact sheet that we have, and we can share some of these other resources. But I think understanding those racial disparities is critical, especially when comparing them to that of exploiters. And so, you know, what that does is really shape how our systems, first responders, and others respond to child victims, right? If they are disproportionately, you know, more likely to be girls of color, Black girls, Native girls, Latina girls, right? And gender expansive youth of color, then how is it that they are being viewed by those entrusted to their care, right? And so I think those concepts of adultification bias and other forms of, you know, implicit biases really impact how our systems and our first responders, you know, address issues of sexual exploitation. Who gets to be seen in our communities, in our society as a victim of crime, entitled to the supports and services that we grant to other victims of child abuse, and who gets to be, you know, seen as an adult, who gets to be seen as complicit in their own exploitation. So I think those themes are really important to keep in mind when we talk about this issue and when we talk about promoting more effective policies and crafting our advocacy. And so, you know, some of the things that have been really great and have been promising is that we have been able to have a lot of bipartisan support, at least at the federal level, and I know at the state level, around this issue. We have seen lots of promising federal laws in the last 10 years, but especially in the last 5 years, laws that have recognized the intersections between child welfare involvement, you know, foster care involvement, and an increased vulnerability to child sex trafficking, laws that recognize that our children who are trafficked are ending up in the juvenile justice system, not always for prostitution offenses, right, but for offenses that are directly related to their exploitation. Dr. Burke talked about running away, right? So teaching ourselves not to problematize the behavior of running away, but asking questions like, why is this child running? What were they running from, or what are they running to, right? Trying to understand the underlying causes of the behavior. And so we've seen a lot of promising federal laws. We have doubled the amount of funding for domestic or for trafficking victim services. We have created specific laws around domestic victims of trafficking. One other thing I think is important to note is when we talk about child sex trafficking, we now know that the vast majority of victims are in fact US born, right? So this isn't, of course, we know, you know, foreign nationals are exploited, but this is really a homegrown problem that warrants a domestic, robust response. One of the other things I'd like to draw attention to, the Department of Health and Human Services convened a National Advisory Committee on child sex trafficking and the sex trafficking of youth, and they just released their preliminary report, so I can share that in the chat a little bit later, that provides best practices and guidance to the states. So I think that's a really important report for folks to look at and kind of see where their states have been doing some of these policies or how they can improve their response. But as you mentioned, in terms of systems, you know, I think child welfare has been, had a really hard time, you know, and I think, you know, some of that is due to the fact that it's historically underfunded, you know, caseworkers are overburdened. But, you know, I think trying to identify children in the child welfare system has been very difficult, although we have laws that are, you know, trying to improve our response. Juvenile justice, same thing. And I think this is where your question about juvenile and family court judges can really be an important intervention. Juvenile judges have an incredible amount of discretion when it comes to how they adjudicate these cases and how they respond to youth in their courtrooms. And so understanding how to look behind the charge, understanding what risk factors and you know, identification mechanisms to employ when you have children coming in a family court setting or a dependency setting, even tribal court judges. You know, we at Rights for Girls have a long-standing partnership with the National Council of juvenile and family court judges, through which we do a National Judicial Institute to help train judges on how to identify children in their courtrooms and then how to more effectively respond in ways that don't rely on punitive measures. So understanding that detention isn't a safe option, right? I think oftentimes we see judges, very well-meaning judges, try to, reason that it's safer or better to lock a girl up who's being trafficked than to let them out for fear of them being re-exploited. But really understanding the harms and the ways in which confinement exacerbates trauma. So those are just some of the things that I think are really important to note. But I will say one of the other advancements that we are making, and this is, largely thanks to survivors in the movement, has been understanding the fundamental injustice of criminalizing child sex trafficking victims. And so I quickly mentioned the No Such Thing as a Child Prostitute campaign, that language really coming from one survivor, T. Ortiz, who is brilliant and fearless and has really just said we need to interrogate the fact that if a child is too young to consent to sex, how is it that we have been criminalizing these children for selling sex, for being exploited? And so we've seen a number of states start to change their laws, provide what's called safe harbor or immunity for prostitution charges for child victims, and to promote their diversion or entry into some sort of services. And so I think that is really, really important, a growing trend that we're seeing, but there's a lot of variation. So I think that's a trend that is encouraging, but of course, there's so much more work to be done.
Thank you. One thing that I really heard from each of you actually was the need to really center all recommendations in the wisdom and the lived experience of survivors. And I loved, for so many reasons, that this conversation this morning actually was rooted in that and grounded in that and will continue to be grounded in that, because the most effective interventions and the brilliant strategies that people have come up with are really from survivors. And I love that our panelists are wanting to ask each other questions. And so I would love to invite Dr. Blake to pose a question, and then also to invite all the other panelists to share sort of, well, I guess, Dr. Blake, you ask your question, and then I'll ask the other panelists to share kind of additional recommendations.
So this is not actually my question. It was in another panel, but I think it's something worthwhile. So for those of us, including the audience, to chime in with chats, for those of us who are in the mental health field, we have this technique called motivational interviewing. And someone recommended that they thought that this was really powerful for working with victims of trafficking. And just to give you some background, motivational interviewing is really this idea of asking questions, but really more listening to what your client says, as opposed to, and letting them enact change and whether they are ready for change, at what point are they ready to engage in services. So you're not directing them, so to speak. So it's but what I want to pose to the panel, for those of us who are familiar with this, is what I think is really powerful about motivational interviewing is what it does to the clinician, because I think that there's judgment there, right? And when you have to slow yourself down and ask questions of clarification to really figure out where this person is and where, if they're ready for services, if they're ready to get out of the life, how do they view themselves, how does that impact you? So I guess this question is more for Dr. Burke. Do you think motivational interviewing is considered an evidence-based strategy, if you will, for working with individuals who are trafficked? And more importantly, is it helpful? I think that we need to really talk about the individuals who are interacting with these youth in the agencies. And I've said this before, we tend to diagnose children and not communities and systems. And we really need to be looking at ourselves and how we're interacting and how our judgments can impact whether or not these youth continue to get services, or, the push and pull. Tawanda, a member of Gwen's Girls, talks about this, goes back into the life, right? And so I'm just wondering, Dr. Burke, if you have any insight about that. I'm sorry, Mahim, but I just can't stop myself.
Please, I love this. This is the meat.
I am glad you brought that up, Dr. Blake. sometimes I think that I use motivational interviewing without remembering that I'm doing that. But I think that it is really helpful to slow me down as a clinician and really to make sure I'm hearing where this person is. And I know that for me, sometimes I feel like I want what's best for this person, and it's hard to remember. Of course, we need to follow their pace, which is a part of relationship building. If I'm over here and wanting them to be over here with me and, wishing for them to be ready to make a change, they can feel me in that. They can feel me not being there next to them and rushing them. And so I think that you're right, that motivational interviewing is a really great way to kind of slow things down and build a relationship. Like if I'm asking questions, like, I'm feeling more connected. It probably just happened with you and I. You're asking me a question, I feel more connected to you. So I think it's a really great tool. Was there a second piece to that?
Oh, no, go ahead. I know Dr. Carrasco had something to add as well.
So, I think I love the direction in which this is going, because it's not just the motivational interviewing, or perhaps those of us who've done this for a long time have learned that you only get somewhere by listening to the kid and creating an atmosphere in which a child can talk. And I am going to now throw Pennsylvania under the bus for its initial response several years ago, when this issue of kids in the child welfare system being more likely to be victims of trafficking came out. And the immediate response from pretty much everyone is, oh, if there's a problem, there's a questionnaire that'll solve that problem. And so there was this very awkward questionnaire that they fortunately tested out in a few locations. And we gave the questionnaire that was being recommended to our primary forensic interviewer, supervising psychologist. And they said, this is ridiculous. This is not a reasonable set of questions to ask a kid. And the idea, when you looked at that particular set of questions that some well-intentioned person set up, was the questions were so intrusive, so off-putting, that switching the idea of getting a disclosure of child sex trafficking is based more on the relationship that you can set up than it is on a specific list of questions. It's how you listen, it's how you ask the questions. It's not necessarily the exact content of the questions. They are important, but you have to know when to ask them and how. So
It reminds me.
I'm off my soapbox.
No, please. I love the soapbox is what we're here for, actually. And kind of listening to each of you, and then also thinking about something Brittany just added to the chat about not pushing anyone into seeing themselves as a victim or getting them out of the life. I think it comes back to what you may have been getting at, Dr. Blake, which is, what is the goal? Is the goal to get a disclosure, or is the goal to build the relationship and to make sure that this young person knows that you have their best interests at heart? And also then how, I think the question is, how do we translate that to systems, right? Something you said, Dr. Blake, when you posed the question was, we don't think about communities. Dr. Burke, you talked about systems. Yeah, all of you have talked about sort of what are the cultural factors, what are the systemic factors. And if you think about the experience of a young person who has been system involved, they've been a checklist or a checkbox or something to a problem to be solved their entire lives, right? So personalizing and really seeing the whole person, as all of you have been saying, has seemed really important. So with that, because it seems like I have some other questions before we get to actually the questions in the chat, which are starting to fill in, and I encourage folks that are watching to keep adding your questions either to the Q&A or the chat. I just wanted to invite any one of the other panelists who wasn't invited to speak about specific recommendations. I know Dr. Burke, you had a few. Dr. Blake, you might have had some additional ones. Yasmin, if there's anything you left out before we get to the broader questions.
So I don't have any specific recommendations. I'm excited to get to the broader questions. That's always the fun part for me, and there's some good questions there. But Yasmin and Dr. Burke, if you have any, please go for it.
I think we can just get to the questions. I mean,
great. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Dr. Burke, were you about to say something?
I mean, I think getting the questions is a great idea. I see something from Ivy McCall, if it's okay if I
absolutely
respond
please
to that. Ivy McCall is saying, I don't know if this is common, but something that I found as a social work intern last year is that clinicians are pushed to use MI CBT because insurance providers are more likely to accept this as to other message, which is really just an indictment of our healthcare system. And I very strongly agree with that push. I mean, I think that we have a big issue in our country with the insurance companies telling clinicians what to do. And in the mental health piece, that's why I kind of brought up I practice from absolutely a feminist perspective, but a more psychodynamic perspective that really gets a bad rap. Is all it really does is think about people in context of the system, in their context of their whole life, and in the context of relationships. And so I try to work that in regardless of what the insurance companies are suggesting that I do.
I actually want to tack on, Yasmin, not to put you on the spot, but I'm wondering actually if you can talk a little bit about the role of community-based organizations in this whole, particularly those that are survivor-led, in this whole sort of infrastructure of pieces of who might come into contact or be supportive of someone. We've been talking a lot about systems, but I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about that particular.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's integral, and that's something that we always promote. And so, one of the other promising practices that I think we were going to be talking about is multidisciplinary teams or cross-system collaboration, making sure that not any one system or agency is tasked with responding to this issue. And a critical part of that intervention and response, whether it's local level, state level, whatever it is, has to be engaging with community-based programs and organizations, ideally survivor-led programs and organizations. Again, I think that is critical. I think one of the themes of this panel has been relationship building, building trust, cultural competency. All of those points are really, really critical. And also being able to provide for services and interventions in the community rather than in detention. That's one of the things that we hear from our work across the country is, well, we had to basically place this child into the juvenile services in order to render, in order to get them any type of support, or, that our funding is tied to juvenile detention. So things like that we have to really interrogate and end, right? If a child needs services and interventions and treatment, they should not have to be criminalized in order to get them those services and supports, right? Same with other types of system involvement, right? In child welfare. And so I think there is a trend towards trying to be more flexible and provide not only holistic, comprehensive services to the child, but to the family where that's needed and necessary. But also, I think, as you said, those community-based programs and supports, ideally those that engage with survivors of trafficking and sexual exploitation, are going to be a really integral part of any type of promising response to this issue. And so, I know for us, we work very closely, that the survivors and the survivor-led programs in our community in DC guide all of our policy and advocacy. And I think, other jurisdictions that have started to really tackle this issue from a promising approach, have really done the same.
Thank you. You'll notice I don't use best
Yeah,
practices.
exactly,
Often
exactly.
Promising is sort of probably a more apropos word. Dr. Blake, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I think, Yasmin, that's a really good point. And one thing I want us to bring in is that our systems are broken, right? The idea that, we can't get services unless we criminalize these youth. And we see this in school districts. We see this across many systems in our country, that you can only get services if you pathologize the behavior or detained, right? And so I tell my students often, we're putting Band-Aids on bullet wounds, if you will, right? And so what this really means from a broader policy issue is how money is funneled, right? And how, I mean, Dr. Burke kind of touched on this in response to one of the questions, right? So if insurance dictates what type of treatment you get, right? If you can only get services if you're in the juvenile justice system, if child welfare only comes in, you know, in these really kind of difficult situations, and we don't build in these kind of preventative, adaptive, community-based organization, and more importantly, we don't give them enough funding to be sustainable, right? Because that's where the problem comes in. This is where philanthropy comes in, but philanthropy can't solve all of our problems. And not to make this very political, but what we're talking about is we have a very broken system. And so we can't work together and work on the whole child because our system is built off of pathology, right? Of a medical model. Like, you only get services if you have a problem. You only get services if, you know, you're perceived as a criminal. And even then the services of sub-quality. So to speak to your point, Yasmin and Maheen, about community organizations, yes, we need community organizations. We need them to be led by survivors, but those organizations need sustainable funding, which means that we need to be talking about, from a policy perspective, how do we reroute these dollars so that they can come in and be more preventative, right? And, or what I might feel we call primary prevention and secondary prevention. And so if it's a funnel, we have less people coming through the funnel. I just wanted to just throw that out there because I think it's a big picture and it's a puzzle. We need to put it together, and all these things that are happening in our country, these uprisings, that these are the things that we need to be thinking about. Like we say, community-based organizations, but they need money to survive, and they need to sustain, you know?
And just really quickly, it's not just to respond, right, and provide programming and treatment, but it's to prevent it, right? And scaling up the funds and you know, programs across the country is really going to help prevent this type of exploitation from happening in the first place. So I completely agree with you, Dr. Blake.
If I could also add on to that, I agree with both of you, Dr. Blake and Yasmin. And I'm thinking about, and what if we zoomed up even higher? I mean, what if families were making a living wage? Mm-hmm. What if our minimum wage was higher? What if the policies and like all the things you're counting on, like the qualifications, what if the ways that things are worded and the qualifications to receive services was different? It would really, like, would we have as much of a need for services if people were financially able to provide for themselves? Would families then be under less stress and maybe therefore not acting out their own, you know, issues with their children? When I think about like resource allocation and ways in which redlining it still occurs in some areas, and how does that affect communities and vulnerability?
Thank you so much. You all are certainly preaching to a lot of choirs, particularly mine as someone who sits in philanthropy and really thinks about where we can, who gets investment. I mean, I'll just throw in, and then we'll get to Felicia's question. I see you. You know, Ms. Foundation recently put out a report that out of the 66.9 billion philanthropic dollars that go out, $5.48 goes to women and girls of color and organizations led by or focused on women and girls of color. So, I mean, I think we really need to take all of your comments to heart when we're thinking about structural things, and also name that when we're thinking about the whole person, the levels of stress that all of you have named. I mean, the ruling around Breonna Taylor's death yesterday is impacting survivors just as much as, particularly Black girls who are survivors, just as much as their exploitation might be. And I think that gets missed. And so I actually want to turn to, I think it's actually a good frame for this question that Felicia, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, asked earlier, which is, how does a clinician's bias, or maybe your own, I'm adding a little color to it, but maybe your own personal experience affect your work when you don't have personal experience living a sexually exploited life?
So, oh, go ahead, Dr.
No, I was going to suggest that you go ahead.
That's so funny. So I think that clinician bias always comes into play. And that's why I asked the question about how do the techniques that we use, like motivational interview, work on impacting the clinician. And so when you don't have the experience of living a life, you really have to get back to what Dr. Caroso said about being a good listener and really being empathetic. And the reason I like, and motivational interviewing isn't just a serious, it's really about relationship building and listening skills and communication skills, right? And so in order for me to have empathy and to really understand where you're coming from, I have to be willing to listen to you and hear your experiences and follow up and understand. But that is something every clinician has to actively work on, is when I'm the lens that I'm understanding and interpreting this, am I bringing in my own values and my own baggage? And this is something that theoretically we're trained to do. We're human beings, so we're subject to error, but we should be constantly being introspective and checking ourselves and checking our bias and checking the language that we're using and the way we're responding and what are hmms and sighs and oh well, what that really means, and are we conveying judgment? So I don't have a very simple kind of black and white response, because I think that this is something that good clinicians do, that they're very introspective, and if they're really interested in helping any client, they're constantly reevaluating their own stance and how they feel about these things and making sure that they're not projecting that or misinterpreting what the individual is saying.
Thank you. While we're waiting for maybe a few other questions in the chat, I actually wanted to, this has been so energizing and there's so much to talk about, but I'm actually wondering if we can kind of turn to the present context, and maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Carrasco. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, and invite all of you to talk about how COVID-19 in particular has impacted or could be impacting strategies to address the needs of survivors.
My sense is that there's less ability to connect effectively because people are doing therapy or therapeutic encounters via Zoom. And much as that has positive things, when you do a Zoom connection with somebody who could be a victim, I too don't like the word victim, and I don't think we should convince people that they are victims. I think we should view it as, here's a better way to be yourself, rather than I'm a victim, therefore I'm, all the things that go with being a victim. But you don't know who else is in the room. During this brief encounter, I've had to wave people away and wave my cat away. And those are like relatively minor intrusions. But when you're talking to someone, you don't know who else is in the room. My experience as a clinician is I am always watching for that parent or that grandma or that father who's hovering a bit too much over this child, and sort of always watching out for who is preventing this child from talking the way they might want to. So I think it adds an additional challenge. Sometimes, though, it can be a positive. If a kid can go out and use their phone to connect with someone, that can be positive. We are also not, while we've continued to see people physically during all of this time, our encounters are not quite the same as they were before, because people are wearing PPE, and it's much harder to read a child, to read a kid or a parent when you're covered up. They can't read you as well, and it's harder to read their expressions. I think we're getting slightly better at it, addressing expressions from here up, but it makes most of our encounters much harder. At the same time, I'm hearing from everyone that this is a time at which the economic insecurity is pushing people to find different ways of earning money, not just kids, but adults. And we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware in all of our encounters to see how people think about this time. So.
Thank you. I do want to get to this one last question from Ivy before I know I would love to hear from the rest of you on your thoughts on COVID-19, and I'll direct this actually to Yasmin first. There was a question about SESTA FOSTA and how it impacts the lives of women and girls who may have been sexually exploited, and maybe you want to kind of spell out what SESTA FOSTA is also for folks who don't know.
Sure.
And then offer some thoughts and hopefully invite the other panelists to do so with the few minutes we have.
Sure. So SESTA FOSTA is one of the federal laws that has been passed in the last 5 or so years. Going back to one of the other themes of this panel, which is the importance of survivor voices and making sure that as advocates, we are following the lead of survivor voices and survivors and their families, and always, putting their needs at the forefront of our advocacy. It's very important to understand that SESTA FOSTA was a survivor-driven effort, and I would invite people who are interested in this issue to watch a documentary on Netflix called I Am Jane Doe that kind of spells out what the atmosphere was like before passage of SESTA FOSTA. But essentially what this law does is it corrects a legal loophole from a 1996 internet law that basically provided full immunity to internet service providers that hosted third-party content. So the reality of what we were seeing in the lives of so many child sex trafficking victims was that they were being advertised for sex on sites like Backpage, Craigslist, and others. The websites knew that they had these ads. The websites were profiting tens of millions of dollars off of these child sex ads. But court after court after court would tell child victims and their families that their hands were tied because federal law provided blanket immunity from not only civil actions, so victims couldn't sue for civil damages and monetary damages, but states could not sue for criminal liability because this was from 1996, and the goal was to promote a flourishing internet. And so all SESTA FOSTA does is remove that legal loophole. So now it allows child victims to sue websites that knowingly facilitate child sex trafficking or promoting prostitution, which is the federal standard for pimping, essentially. And so it's a very difficult standard. It's hard to prove, but because this was the first time that this law had been eroded from the tech industry, which is a very powerful lobby, we are seeing a lot of misinformation about FOSTA SESTA. We are seeing people conflating it and saying things like it shut down websites. It didn't shut down websites. It allows child victims to sue for civil damages or state attorneys general to sue bad actor websites for criminal liability. So that's all it does. And if websites did shut down, it's because they had exposure. And so we saw a lot of websites shut down because they probably knew that trafficking was happening on their site. And so they self-policed and shut themselves down. Backpage.com was seized by the Department of Justice before the law ever passed. So because these things kind of happened around the same time, and because we're talking about the tech industry, there was a lot of misinformation. But at the end of the day, this was survivor driven. And again, I would invite folks to look at that documentary, as well as the testimony from Yvonne Robinson and the mother of Desiree Robinson, who was a 16-year-old who was killed by meeting someone on Backpage.com, and just countless families whose lives have been shaped. So thank you for that question. I'm happy to answer questions offline about it as well.
Yeah, I see that there were a few questions that we didn't get to, and I'm sorry that we are actually out of time, but it's been such a pleasure to chat with all of you brilliant women this morning. We will try to get to your questions and some of the resources that were mentioned by sending them out at the end of the chat, but just thank you so much to all these wonderful panelists for such a lively and important discussion.
Yes, thank you so much, ladies. Appreciate your just knowledge, sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and just look forward to continuing the conversation. I know that there's information on the resources in the chat, and we will also be sending information out post summit. Thank you.